Buenas tardes a todos, muchísimas gracias por estar acá. Es un enorme honor hoy tenerlo a Dani Rodrik y poder distinguirlo con esta distinción que le vamos a hacer, el doctor Honoris Causa. Pero bueno, para calentar motores vamos a empezar con este panel dedicado a mostrar casos de éxito, que hay pocos en Argentina, casos de, no por falta de éxito, quizás, sino por falta de continuidad, de ámbitos de interacción público-privada. Y para eso tenemos, voy a tratar de ser muy breve, tres panelistas de lujo. En primer lugar, voy a ponerlos tal como aparecieron en la publicidad de este evento. Andrés Michel. Andrés es licenciado en Economía y más licenciado por la Universidad de Río Cuarto, magíster por la Universidad de Tucumán. Es el secretario de Política Económica del Ministerio de Economía y Gestión de la Provincia de Córdoba. Tiene una larga experiencia en diseñar ámbitos de interacción público-privado. Diseñó la estrategia de las mesas ejecutivas para la transformación productiva en el Ministerio de Producción y Empleo en Argentina en los años 2018 y 2019. Y viene acá en calidad de representando Córdoba Acelera, de la cual fue codiseñador, cofundador y fue director durante los años 2022 y 2023. Después vamos a tener a Norberto Nigro. Norberto es ingeniero mecánico, egresado de la UTN de Buenos Aires. Tiene un doctorado en la Universidad de Córdoba en Ciencias de la Ingeniería y un postdoctorado en el Instituto de Supercomputación de Minnesota. Investigador principal del CONICET, profesor asociado de la Universidad Nacional del Litoral y preside desde 2018 el Parque Tecnológico Litoral del Centro, que es una sociedad anónima dedicada a la creación e incubación de empresas de base tecnológica. Y tenemos finalmente un cierre distinguido con María Laura Palacios. María Laura es ingeniera en sistemas de información egresada de la UTN, también tiene una diplomatura en inteligencia de negocios, es CEO del GIL Group, una empresa con 30 años de trayectoria en la industria de tecnología de la información, directora de talento de la CESI y vocal titular primera del Polo IT de Buenos Aires, al que viene a representar. Tenemos tres casos distintos, diversos, donde se va a mostrar una diversidad de arreglos institucionales para organizar la interacción público-privada y quizás eso va a ser lo más interesante, no hay una receta única. Con esto le doy lugar a los panelistas. Quizás, Andrés, ¿querés empezar? Andrés Michel, adelante.
Hola. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación. Buenas tardes a todos los presentes. La verdad que es un honor poder estar acá y tener el espacio para contar esta experiencia de articulación público-privada, que como bien mencionó Juan Carlos, se llama, porque sigue en curso, Córdoba Acelera, que es una agencia encargada de ejecutar la política productiva a nivel de un municipio, de una ciudad. Y ya con eso vamos dando ciertos matices de lo que pretendo resumir en esta exposición. En primer lugar, vamos a estructurar la presentación en 4 ejes que me parece que pueden ordenar la conversación, que tienen que ver cómo abordamos ciertos desafíos. El primero tiene que ver con la construcción de credibilidad o construcción de confianza. El segundo tiene que ver con nichos de acción, en donde Córdoba Acelera decidió implementar las acciones. El tercero tiene que ver con la selección de los actores. Y un cuarto eje tiene que ver con la construcción de capacidades en las políticas públicas. Bueno, eso es más o menos cómo vamos a presentar de manera resumida esta experiencia. Bueno, primero, para destacar, Córdoba Acelera nace a través de un instrumento normativo que es una ordenanza que fue votada por unanimidad en el legislativo local, una decisión del entonces intendente Martín Yarzora, hoy nuestro gobernador, y de Guillermo Acosta, que era el Secretario de Economía del municipio y Ministro de Economía. Y encontramos una oportunidad en el medio de la pandemia y de una macro muy adversa, y digo, para un gobierno local, la pregunta es, ¿hay margen para hacer política productiva o política industrial? Y bueno, la respuesta fue sí, y ese es el nacimiento de esta normativa, que la verdad que en la letra nos imaginábamos una cosa y después en el despliegue, en el desenlace, créanme que encontramos resultados que en un momento inicial eran soñados. En ese sentido, la construcción de credibilidad tuvo que ver con que establecía esta ordenanza que el espacio era público-privado, o sea que tendría que haber una confluencia de actores públicos y de actores privados. Y es así donde esta construcción de confianza se involucran 7 empresarios de la ciudad que representan a distintos sectores de la economía. Ya voy a hablar del perfil, pero el perfil es un perfil de servicios y eso tuvo que ver con estos 7 empresarios. Los 7 empresarios comprometidos con el desarrollo de la ciudad, y el desafío era conectar a Córdoba con el mundo. Es decir, lograr una inserción internacional que en algún momento tuvo, que la venía teniendo la ciudad, pero básicamente esto era trabajarlo de una manera decidida y con un equipo a tal efecto. En ese sentido es importante mencionar y destacar la reputación de estos actores privados que nos ayudaban a nosotros, facilitan a los policy makers a poder tomar ciertas decisiones, un advisory board donde se generaban reuniones una vez al mes. Al comienzo era más fluido hasta que encontramos una dinámica y una metodología de funcionamiento, porque no había nada escrito. Sí habíamos observado otros benchmarks, como el caso de Agencia Catalana, Acció, que siempre miramos, SPRI en el País Vasco, lo que hacen los austríacos en Alta Austria, etc. Pero en ese sentido tuvimos que recorrer un camino y crear una forma de trabajar que no estaba en los papeles. En cuanto al segundo punto, que tiene que ver con los nichos de acción, es decir, bueno, ¿en dónde definió trabajar Córdoba Acelera? Lo primero que se hizo fue hacer un raconto de qué teníamos y de qué instrumentos no teníamos. Eso es importante como punto de partida. A nivel local, obviamente, el margen de recursos y de instrumentos es mucho más acotado. Es decir, por ejemplo, hay ciertas cosas que no podemos manejar, que están dadas, son un dato, la macro. ¿Sí? Entonces eso, claramente, no podemos incidir, pero tampoco podemos omitir la evolución de la macro, cómo impacta en nuestros perfiles que queremos potenciar y desarrollar. Pero sí encontramos un área de oportunidades enormes, y es ahí donde definimos, siguiendo lo que dice la literatura, Stein, Crespi Fernández, 2014, de Rethinking el desarrollo productivo, las políticas de desarrollo productivo, es intervenciones de mercado horizontales y verticales. Bueno, las que teníamos en el municipio, más bien acotadas, tratar de justificarlas, pero decidió trabajar Córdoba Acelera en la construcción de bienes públicos horizontales y bienes públicos verticales. ¿Sí? Dentro de los bienes públicos horizontales se trabajó muchísimo en agilizar los trámites, que habilitar un negocio sea de manera muy ágil, que habilitar un permiso de construcción también sea lo más ágil posible. Y aquí hay un punto interesante porque se conecta con algo que voy a decir más adelante, que tiene que ver con un clúster puntual, en donde la interacción público-privada hizo y mucho. Y después, lo que tiene que ver con los bienes públicos verticales, justamente es el siguiente punto: cómo resolvimos este problema, que significa, bueno, con qué sectores trabajar, y en el fondo también con qué sectores no. O sea, que cuando uno le pregunta, tiene que ser consciente de esto. En cuanto a la construcción insisto, de bienes públicos y verticales y horizontales, si lo tuviera que resumir, es que Córdoba Acelera se profesionalizó en producir bienes públicos. O sea, no hay mucho escrito, o sea, hay mucho escrito, pero no hay mucho escrito sobre cómo se trabaja en la diaria para hacer más eficiente la función de producción de los bienes públicos. Y esos bienes públicos, si no los produce el Estado, bueno, ahí tenemos una oportunidad que vamos perdiendo. Pero también hay que ser eficiente produciendo eso. Y dentro del horizontal voy a mencionar 3 herramientas o programas. Uno de ellos tiene que ver con Córdoba Invest, que es hacer muy eficiente la búsqueda de inversiones, la atracción y una vez que estás, el one-stop shop. Es decir, que sea lo más rápido posible porque queremos que inviertas, no que no inviertas. Entonces, bueno, a veces en la práctica los gobiernos parece que se ponen de acuerdo para hacerle la vida imposible a la inversión. Bueno, en ese sentido, logramos hacer eficiente y ordenar todo el conjunto de trámites para que sea de una manera fluida. Pero insisto, toda esta instancia de búsqueda, selección y luego de acuerdo al ciclo de vida de la inversión. Otro programa que es muy interesante, Hausmann lo menciona mucho, de mover cerebro, conectar y demás, que es la diáspora. Decidió Córdoba trabajar fuertemente la diáspora. En algún momento dijimos, tiene que haber 300 cordobeses de alta calificación en puestos de relieve, y hoy tenemos un poquito más de 200 identificados en distintos países del mundo, y esta red tiene la ventaja de que le quieren devolver cosas a la ciudad, que tienen un compromiso con la ciudad, que están dispuestos a aportar ideas. Entonces lo que les ofrecimos fue una metodología para que esas ideas, que cuando visitaban Córdoba, mirá, quiero cambiar esto porque vi que en Suiza funciona así. Bueno, perfecto. ¿Y cómo seguimos? Entonces lo que permitió, lo que desarrolló Córdoba Acelera es una tecnología para adoptar este tipo de ideas y poder canalizarlas y conducirlas. Quien lidera el governance de todo esto, que coordina, es un empresario de muchísima experiencia en una láctea en Suiza, cordobés, muy comprometido, y se encargó con 4 ejes temáticos de ordenar toda esta red. Cuando el intendente en aquel momento, ahora el gobernador, visita distintos países, se junta con este grupo y suceden cosas muy interesantes. Y el tercer programa tiene que ver con trabajar los nómades digitales. Los nómades digitales, que son personas que tienen una preferencia bastante particular, porque trabajan en cualquier lugar del mundo, pero requieren un conjunto de bienes que tienen que estar bastante organizados y secuenciados, y tiene que estar preparada la ciudad para eso. Bueno, en el ranking Digital Nomads, luego del programa, escaló fuertemente el ranking de Córdoba. Y en eso nos encontramos con cosas atrapantes. Por ejemplo, el video Digital Nomads es un nativo, porque nosotros dijimos tiene que ser alguien que hable inglés nativo, que venda el programa. Bueno, es un australiano, y el equipo del clúster que está vinculado con los sectores audiovisuales dice, bueno, nosotros queremos promocionar lo que nosotros hacemos. Conclusión, ese producto nos salió 0. O sea, bueno, es parte del trabajo intercluster. Voy al siguiente punto, el tercero, y tiene que ver con cómo seleccionamos sectores. 70% del PIB o GDP de la ciudad, servicios. Dentro de esos servicios dijimos, vamos a apuntar a aquellos servicios que tienen posibilidad de conectarse con el mundo. Vamos a hablar de los traders. Y es ahí donde, a través de los datos, encontramos, por ejemplo, voy a resumir de manera muy escueta, la participación de la ciudad de Córdoba en el PIB nacional es de 3%. Entonces dijimos, todos aquellos sectores que tengan salario muy alto en servicio, que tengan posibilidad de conectarse con el mundo y que tengan una participación mayor al 3%, 2, 3 más veces, y le vamos a prestar atención. Bueno, es así donde encontramos 8 clústeres que organizamos, y le agregamos un segundo elemento, no solamente la parte de datos, sino aquellos sectores que pueden tener todas estas condiciones, pero donde había capacidades institucionales previas y había capacidades de abrirse a trabajar con el sector público. No todos los sectores o empresarios están decididos a trabajar con el sector público. En ese sentido, ahí destaco el clúster BIM, que es un servicio, el 40% de BIM, de la industria BIM está en Córdoba, y ahí logramos, a través de la facilitación de permisos, con un model checker, potenciar a esta industria que es netamente exportadora, y el 75% de los trabajadores, por ejemplo, habla inglés. Y por último, quiero hablar de las capacidades que se necesitan. Bueno, aquí la enseñanza es que hay que producir bienes públicos. Entonces, ¿alguien del sector privado puede sumarse? Sí, bueno, Córdoba Acelera incorporó muchas personas del sector privado. De hecho, cada uno de estos clústeres, que son 8, tiene un cluster manager que lo seleccionan los privados. Nosotros como programa definimos durante 2 años acompañarlo a su salario. y la gobernanza de cada uno de esos clústeres se la dicta cada uno de los empresarios privados. El sector público ahí no interviene, o sea, se arreglan entre privados. Entonces ahí construimos junto con el sector privado capacidades, pero también había un staff entre nuestro equipo que venía con ciertas experiencias a nivel nacional, municipal, provincial, que fueron capacidades muy útiles, porque para producir bienes públicos uno necesita conocer cómo es el funcionamiento, dónde están las trabas, cómo es el idioma del sector público. Y me parece que en ese sentido ahí hay un valor agregado. Permíteme, Juanca, y cierro con esto. Parece trivial. Córdoba Acelera generó un ecosistema totalmente distinto. Lo primero que hicimos fue cambiar de lugar físico. Nos mudamos a un lugar donde suceden los negocios. Entonces, es un lugar ameno para los empresarios. Bueno, de estas cosas hay un montón que no están escritas, que obviamente están documentadas, pero las vamos a documentar, pero que son muy útiles. Bueno, esta es más o menos de una manera acelerada un brief de la experiencia de Córdoba Acelera. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Andrés. Norberto, ¿querés seguir?
Bueno, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Yo voy a cambiar un poquito el marco de referencia. Me voy a ubicar mucho en la micro. Específicamente en lo que atañe a la construcción y a la idea de lo que fue el Parque Tecnológico, un parque que tiene 22 años, que nació allá en los años 70 como idea. Después hace 22 que tenemos un pie formal. En los años 70 a los investigadores que estaban en Santa Fe se les ocurrió viajar por el mundo y capacitarse para venir a Santa Fe a tratar de instalar ahí un polo de ciencia, un polo de valor. Hoy tenemos una de las ciudades que tiene más cantidad de investigadores por habitante. Tenemos 2.500 investigadores en la región metropolitana. Tenemos un núcleo de universidades y de estudiantes, de más de 90.000 estudiantes, con más de 150 carreras de grado y otro tanto de posgrado, 65 de posgrado. O sea, es una ciudad universitaria, Santa Fe, una ciudad donde se transpira y se respira conocimiento, se respira el capital de valor. Y nosotros creemos que eso ha sido muy importante y ha sido un poco el catalizador de lo que hoy es el Parque Tecnológico, un parque que tiene 27 empresas hoy instaladas en el parque en distintos estadios, desde empresas que están incubadas, recién empezando, empresas que no facturan, empresas que facturan y exportan a más de 30 países, una cartera de 40 productos aproximadamente, en el sector mayormente biotecnológicas, algunas de las TICs y algunas de servicios de ingeniería. Nosotros nos enfocamos mucho, más que nada en ingeniería y en software. Nosotros creemos que el rol del Estado en todo esto, y un poco viniendo a lo que tiene que ver con la charla de hoy, es muy importante en el sentido de que no solamente porque hay fondos públicos que de alguna manera con los cuales competimos con el sector privado, en un sentido positivo competimos con el sector privado, pero el Estado en realidad pone un capital que es mucho mayor aún que eso, que es el capital humano, todo el conocimiento, ¿no? Hoy la economía se define en lo que son las empresas basadas en el conocimiento, en empresas que tengan una llegada al mundo global mucho más importante, mucho más potente, y creemos que justamente el Estado es quien puede poner todo ese capital humano al servicio de la investigación. O sea, hoy la investigación básica no paga, no rinde. O sea, ¿qué privado puede invertir en investigación básica? Y con investigación básica es como hoy hacemos, por ejemplo, una de las empresas del parque, Polo Biotech, es una empresa que hoy, mediante técnica de ARN mensajero, modifica de alguna manera cómo la planta tiene que entender el riesgo de enfermarse y no enfermarse. Justamente una frutilla, un tomate o un banano pueden nacer con mucha mayor sanidad a lo largo de toda su vida de producción gracias a todo ese trabajo genético que hace esta empresa, cuyo investigador líder, Federico Ariel, investigador del CONICET, premiado a nivel mundial en varios lugares del mundo, bueno, tuvo esa idea y la puso ahí en el Parque Tecnológico. Hoy lo tenemos a Federico con nosotros, realmente es un orgullo para nosotros tenerlo. Lo mismo, bueno, hay muchas otras empresas, podría mencionar una de las empresas más importantes que tenemos, que que es la primera exportadora de la ciudad de Santa Fe. Se llama Celtec, es una empresa que en el año 92 la Universidad Nacional del Litoral la incubó. La incubó en 1992. En Argentina eso es casi prehistórico, ¿no? Y bueno, esa fue una idea de la universidad. La universidad está muy presente junto con el CONICET y gracias a esos dos ámbitos de ciencia y valor es que el Parque Tecnológico se pudo haber desarrollado. Yo creo que es vital tener ese núcleo de conocimiento. Ahora, ¿qué pasa cuando uno no tiene eso, ¿no? Porque a nosotros nos visitan, por ejemplo, gente que viene de lugares recónditos de la provincia de Santa Fe, de Reconquista, de Villa Guillermina, de Tostado Ceres, lugares de la provincia, como si yo le diría Casa Liqueló, Trenquelauquen, bueno, lugares donde no hay nada, no hay investigadores. Bueno, ¿cómo se hace? Bueno, a nosotros se nos ocurrió una idea, lo que se llama Puerto de Innovación. Tenemos un espacio dentro del predio del Parque Tecnológico, un predio de 83 hectáreas que tenemos, un espacio dedicado a la incubación de empresas que instalan un contenedor marítimo, instalan su idea, toman el capital humano que hay en nuestro lugar, desarrollan la idea, ponen el contenedor en un camión y se lo llevan al lugar que quieren y lo continúan, lo escalan en el lugar que quieren. Eso vale tanto para una empresa que está en un lugar desfavorecido por todo lo que es el mapeo de lo que sería la instalación de las capacidades o la oferta tecnológica, o también empresas que, porque el parque no es un parque para escalar a lo grande, es un parque que lo que se hace es más bien I más D. Tratamos de buscar que las empresas desarrollen su núcleo, su kernel, y después la vayan a escalar a otros lados. Y bueno, y acá es importante, lo que hace determinante al parque es la gobernanza. La gobernanza es una SAPEM, o sea, es una sociedad anónima con participación estatal mayoritaria. Un tercio de las acciones la tiene el sector científico, como el Triángulo de Sábato, ¿no? Un tercio los gobiernos públicos de la provincia de Santa Fe, el municipio de Santa Fe y el municipio de Paraná, y un tercio los privados. Y con los privados no solamente discutimos en el board, ¿sí? En el directorio, políticas que después le trasladamos a los políticos para que realmente las traten de llevar a cabo, especialmente las muy delicadas que son el ambiente regulatorio, todo el ambiente aduanero, tarifario, impositivo, etcétera, sino también, y esto creo que es importante, es eso que se llama sinergia, que es una palabra que está muy de moda y que parece una palabrita y nada más, y sin embargo si uno la ejercita bien y la ejercita a rajatabla, realmente puede dar su fruto. Nosotros prácticamente el parque no se fondea con ninguna empresa, el parque hace gestión tecnológica y nada más, pero el parque está permanentemente monitoreando lo que le pasan a todas las empresas. Se reúne cada 6 meses con cada una de las empresas, monitoreamos todo y cuando hay una necesidad o una amenaza tratamos de ayudarlos y cuando hay una oportunidad abrir las puertas. Eso un poco es la síntesis del parque, ¿no? Cuando digo de gobernanza y hablo de un tercio del sector científico, un tercio de los gobiernos y un tercio la parte privada, cuando digo un tercio de los gobiernos también me refiero a que cuando nos sentamos con los gobernantes, con el gobernador o con la secretaria de Ciencia, le trasladamos un poco todas las necesidades del parque y todo lo que conviene que la política haga o ponga a disposición. Y tal es así que Santa Fe desde el 2007 generó un Ministerio de Ciencia y Tecnología y ahora Secretaría, porque el gobierno anterior lo bajó al mote de Secretaría, pero igual sigue teniendo un rol bastante protagónico, lo que sería la Secretaría de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación. Y con ellos trabajamos muy codo a codo para generar política. La verdad que en ese sentido Santa Fe nos abre la puerta para poder tener un diálogo muy profundo y eso es vital, es clave para poder justamente tratar de hacer que lo público y lo privado se pongan más de acuerdo y puedan llegar a dar realmente un salto de lo que tenemos que cambiar en este país, porque realmente yo creo que acá hay mucho potencial. Acá en Argentina hay un capital humano enorme, está reconocido eso a todos los niveles, y bueno, tenemos un instituto como el CONICET y las universidades nacionales que forman recursos humanos que son de gran valor y que los tenemos que defender hoy más que nunca. Y bueno, nada, creo que con eso más o menos, no sé si me sobró mucho tiempo, pero si quieren hacer alguna preguntita, a disposición.
Excelente, Norberto, no, bárbaro. Ahora va a haber momento después de otro momento. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, y ahora tenemos a María Laura Palacios. Fíjense que en esto de mostrar también diversidad de arreglos institucionales. Tenemos, Norberto viene del sector académico, científico, Andrés del sector gubernamental, y ahora vamos a tener a María Laura, que viene del sector privado. María Laura, todo tuyo.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, hoy me toca venir con el sombrero del Poli de Buenos Aires. El Polo es una asociación sin fines de lucro que nació hace 20 años, que tiene como fin impulsar el desarrollo de las empresas de software de la ciudad de Buenos Aires y el área metropolitana, y trabajamos en conjunto con el gobierno de la ciudad y con las universidades, ¿no? Actualmente somos alrededor de 230 empresas que participamos y que trabajamos en conjunto. El 60% de esas empresas tienen certificación de calidad y más del 40% exporta periódicamente sus servicios. Y en este camino que hacemos con el gobierno, que hicimos con el gobierno de la ciudad de Buenos Aires, nos pusimos en el lugar de interlocutores entre las empresas y los organismos, ¿no? Y también ahí trabajamos políticas y trabajamos ejes que para nosotros empresarios son importantes. La industria tecnológica está sufriendo, digamos, la felicidad, porque decimos sufrir, pero realmente es una bendición de ser una industria de pleno empleo, y que hay digamos, muchas posiciones no se pueden cubrir por la cantidad, porque no tenemos las personas capacitadas para cubrir esas posiciones. Entonces, para nosotros la formación es un tema de mucha preocupación, y eso lo trabajamos mucho en conjunto con el gobierno y con las universidades. Desde el lado privado vamos a las escuelas secundarias, sensibilizamos a los chicos de las escuelas secundarias para que miren esta industria, miren esta profesión, que a veces también está con un halo de preconceptos que quizás no son los reales. Entonces vamos mucho a las escuelas secundarias. Trabajamos con las instituciones en los que son los trayectos formativos, apoyamos esos trayectos formativos, participamos en lo que son las prácticas profesionalizantes, dándole cabida a los estudiantes a que vengan a nuestras empresas y también se terminen de formar. Trabajamos mucho también en el eje de empleo y de la primera inserción laboral. El gobierno de la ciudad tiene programas tuvo programas de primer empleo que nosotros desde la industria los utilizamos muchísimo, son muy, muy buenos. También cuando fue la creación del distrito tecnológico, apoyamos esa creación del distrito. No sé si conocen de qué se trata, pero hay un espacio dentro de la ciudad de Buenos Aires, en la zona sur de la ciudad de Buenos Aires, donde en un radio de X manzanas se fomentó, hay incentivos para que las empresas de tecnología nos instalemos ahí. Eso provocó que una zona de la ciudad que estaba bastante desfavorable para la comunicación y para digamos, los accesos, tuviese un crecimiento muy importante. Hoy llega el subte, hoy tiene muchísima actividad. Para las empresas fue un lugar donde hay universidades, o sea, se pudo armar un conglomerado muy rico para todos nosotros, y nosotros desde el lado del Polo también ayudamos a traccionar a que las empresas tomen esa decisión de irse al distrito y trabajar para que irse al distrito sea algo positivo para todos. Trabajamos en conjunto también con créditos para la industria tecnológica que diera el Banco Ciudad. En eso articulamos. También articulamos en lo que es la adhesión a la Ley de Economía del Conocimiento. Nuestra industria tiene una Ley de Economía del Conocimiento que cada una de las ciudades tiene que adherir para que pueda hacer efecto. Trabajamos en eso. Y creo que uno de los digamos, hitos muy relevantes en esta articulación público-privada fue la generación del monitor TIC. Tener datos fehacientes y homogéneos entre lo privado y lo público es súper importante, y esta generación y este trabajo que costó un montón y que hoy tenemos con el gobierno de la ciudad, creo que es un hito a replicar en otros sectores, ¿no? Hoy hablamos de empleo, hablamos de facturación, hablamos de exportación y todos hablamos de lo mismo y con los mismos datos y con los mismos números, ¿no? Y eso es súper importante. Bueno, desde ya que apoyamos y ayudamos a la creación de programas de fortalecimiento de nuestras empresas para fomentar el I+D, para fomentar la calidad, para fomentar que nuestras empresas lleguen al exterior. Con el gobierno de la ciudad también trabajamos mucho con InvestBA, que es la parte del gobierno que hace las misiones comerciales, y bueno, y ahí también vemos dónde son los destinos que nos interesan, dónde son los destinos que nos generan valor y a los que queremos llegar, y en conjunto podemos trabajar. Trabajamos en conjunto con ellos en la diáspora. La diáspora argentina es algo valiosísimo que todos tenemos que aprovechar y todos tenemos que trabajar, y si lo hacemos mancomunadamente, muchísimo mejor, ¿no? Y creo que en líneas generales es eso. Y bueno, como institución entendemos que la articulación público-privada es el camino, ¿no? Y eso es lo que tenemos que profundizar. Así que, bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Una cosa que quería también agregar, a raíz de también tu intervención, que me había olvidado de decirla, es bueno, la importancia de la retención de talento es clave, ¿no? Porque en la universidad se genera mucho talento y si no tratamos de darle trabajo desafiante a esos chicos que quieren ir, no solamente por lo económico y porque el país no le brinda oportunidades, sino porque el trabajo, ¿no? Pero otra cosa que también es importante y quiero destacar son dos cosas. La política de género, fundamental, estamos trabajando en política de género, creo que eso hay que reforzar y mucho, y todo lo que tiene que ver con parques tecnológicos amigables con el medio ambiente. El medio ambiente no se puede negociar. Eso es sustentabilidad futura, nada más.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Un panel de lujo, no solo por la calidad del contenido, sino por el respeto a los tiempos. No sé qué decir, excelente. Bueno, tenemos ahora el súper privilegio de tener al profesor Dani Rodrik, ya va a ser presentado. Reaccionar de la forma que encuentre más conveniente a las exposiciones de los panelistas.
Is this working? Yes. Thank you, Juan Carlos. It's really a great privilege for me to be here. And I really want to thank the two panelists who have given necessarily very brief overviews of an incredibly important array of work that they're doing. You know, when I was invited to come here, one of the things that I wanted to do was highlight how a productive collaboration between the private sector and the public sector could actually work. And I have plenty of examples, and I'll talk about some of them in my presentation later on. But I knew that one of the things that I would have to encounter is the skepticism if you believe that the state is incapable of doing anything good. And today many people in Argentina believe that, and with some degree of reason given the recent history of state intervention in the economy. But there's always this skepticism that, well, you know, maybe this worked elsewhere, but it will never work in Argentina, that the Argentinian state is completely incapable of actually doing good, and the best that it can do is simply let business and the private markets do their job. So I thought it was going to be important to actually have some reflections on Argentina's own experience that this can be done. And I think what the three presentations that we've heard is actually very important and concrete illustrations of how, in fact, often under the radar screen, this work does get done, and it does produce results, and is precisely the kind of a government bureaucracies, government scientists, government agencies who are engaging with the private sector, not with the mindset of let's give you a tax incentive, let's give you a subsidy, but with a mindset of let's figure out where the problems are, let's figure out where the obstacles are, and you will tell us what those are because we actually don't necessarily know. We'll learn alongside with you and we'll innovate and iterate with you. Now that can all sound very good in theory and very hypothetical until you hear that that's actually what does happen, often though remaining hidden from the sight of national economic policymakers. Now I mentioned national economic policymakers because one of the interesting themes running through these presentations, of course, is that we heard all from subnational policies, experiments that were being done at the level of municipalities. And I think there is a couple of reasons why that is in fact not just part of Argentina's history, but also in other countries as well, that some of the most important and interesting work that we might call sort of public-private collaboration with the objective of productive transformation and productive upgrading really takes place at the subnational level. One, I will say perhaps just maybe a little bit in jest, is that there's never been a Washington consensus for how you run your city, whereas there's been a Washington consensus about how you run your national economy. And I think that has actually crowded out the national ideas about here are the 10 things or the 15 things and the 20 things. The list kept growing longer and longer. But here's what you have to do in terms of what your fiscal minister, finance minister has to do, what your central bank governor has to do, what your trade minister or your industry minister has to do. Those sort of, is this not? Is this, okay. Is this working still? Okay. I won't start from the beginning. Okay. So, at the city level, I think there has been much greater room for experimentation and taking a kind of a much more of a problem-solving orientation, because there's never been a kind of a blueprint, a guidebook that sort of come from abroad, and these are the good rules of behavior. And I think that's one reason why we're seeing this at the city level. The other kind of thing that's a little bit common, I think, in the presentations, I didn't get the backgrounds of all of you, but I think at least two of you are engineers or scientists. And again, that's significant because engineers and scientists are problem solvers. If you leave this to economists with their sort of preconceived notions about how markets work well and so forth, you're much less likely to get that kind of an engineering problem solving mindset. And I think this is also a significant. I think there were so many interesting things that I think connect among what we've heard. Is sort of one of the key themes is, and I briefly alluded to that, is how this work is really not about providing giveaways to the private sector. It's not about subsidies. It's not about tax incentives. Because often when you talk about productive development policies or sort of often called industrial policies, and it's really, the image that many people think is just basically incentivizing the private sector through tax incentives or maybe through trade protection or through other kinds of subsidies. This is really very different. This is really about understanding what the problems are, where the constraints are, and providing the specific public inputs that are required to help the private sector do their job. And these are the things that only the public sector can do because they have the ability to coordinate, to elicit information, to solve problems jointly. So we've heard many examples of this, whether it is attracting skilled entrepreneurs or engineers from the diaspora, right? So no individual firm will engage in this, but it is in the interest of all of them to have access to this source of talent, which at the city level, city programs can do. It's about providing the coordination, bringing potential investors and innovators around the table. It's about providing reliable information or data that was mentioned. Again, that this is not any sort of something that any individual firm will do, but it's the role that of a public agencies provide. About investing in R&D. It's about ensuring that the regulations are right and in providing the kinds of standard, providing the land or the areas where this activities need to be taken, investing in precisely the kind of training and workforce development that these nascent clusters may need, or starting up tech incubators. So these are all, I'm just listing some of the things that we heard in the presentations about how these kinds of efforts are connecting with existing nascent innovators and producers, as well as potentially new investors to grow these activities. Another theme that really came across is this is in some way the dog that didn't bark here, which is that we didn't hear much about manufacturing. Again, when you talk about productive development, industrial policy, you simply, one thing you think about is subsidies and tax incentives. The other thing is really you think about manufacturing and industrial firms. But these activities, as that we just heard, are really have a service orientation. They're really focusing on services. And that's, again, a reflection of how people who are doing this on the ground in a pragmatic way have taken on the reality that I think many economists and other sort of national level policymakers haven't yet internalized, which is the future of growth and innovation and job creation is very much now in services rather than in manufacturing. So, that's not where, focus on manufacturing is not going to take you anywhere today. So that's, I think, an important change in orientation when you think about productive development policy, needing to sort of how do I upgrade public services, particularly those that might be labor absorbing. Finally, I think, again, a theme that I picked up that sort of, again, was common in all three presentations is that, and this links up with my previous, is that you need to necessarily learn. So that means that you start with an open mind. You don't start with a, given notions about, what this is supposed to entail. So experimentation, iteration, revision is all part of this thing. And you change things as you learn more. So you learn in the act of engaging in this activity. And then I'll end with this problem, with this point, which is that when you look at sort of these sets of activities, it also shows us a very important way out from the usual skeptical argument about why the state cannot do this, which is that the state does not have capacity. It's fine for China to do it, but we don't have the state capacity to do this. But I think what we've just heard is that state capacity is actually something that is built. You don't, so you build it through this process of engaging with the private sector, with the innovators, with the investors. It's not something that comes naturally. It's not something that just drops from the sky on your lap ever. So you of course start with a weak capacity, but sort of you build capacity in the process of doing this. So there's a lot of learning by doing that takes place, which is precisely how you build capacity. So the argument against doing this is never, well, we don't have the capacity. Well, you never will have the capacity if you don't try to do it. It's only by doing it that you will develop that capacity. So again, I want to thank the panelists for what I've learned a lot, and I would guess that you have as well. If I'm allowed to ask them a question, maybe I'd like to, I think I heard you in your description say about how some of the problems you couldn't fix, which is sort of the broader macroeconomic context and so forth. I wonder if the other two of you can also say something about how you address some of the constraints about the larger macroeconomic context, the larger macroeconomic uncertainty, how that affected your work. And then maybe a couple of reflections about what might be the difficulties of scaling up this model to more sort of a national level, if you will.
Perdón. ¿Ves? Bueno, nosotros como institución... como institución tenemos el modelo nacional también, que es con CESI, que es la Cámara de Software, que ahí tenemos el mismo vínculo que tenemos el Polo con la ciudad, lo tiene la Cámara y los distintos polos y clústeres de las provincias argentinas con el gobierno nacional, digamos. Lo que nosotros trabajamos es a nivel la Cámara, con todos los problemas nacionales y que refieren al gobierno nacional, y cada una de las instituciones locales manejan esos mismos problemas con una cercanía mucho mayor con el gobierno local. Eso de esa manera lo estamos trabajando a nivel nacional. No hay otra. Hola. Bueno, la tercera es la vencida. Bueno, los problemas macroeconómicos fueron y siguen siendo un gran escollo, ¿no? Creo que el gran problema que tuvimos nosotros fue, bueno, el tema del talento es un gran problema que tenemos, y creo que el problema macroeconómico que hizo que los talentos, haya una gran fuga de talento en los últimos años, lo contrarrestamos con el aumento de capacitación y el poder tratar de ponerle el foco a generar más y mejores talentos, ¿no? Creo que ahí es un punto donde nosotros le pusimos el foco como para poder contrarrestar eso que en lo macro no podíamos solucionar como empresarios, ¿no? Era algo que ya nos venía dado y que nos afectaba claramente, ¿no? Así que por ese lado pudimos verlo de esa manera.
Sí, yo mucho no sé si voy a poder aportar. Lo único que puedo decir es que en los contextos súper inflacionarios que hemos tenido, hemos tratado de trabajar de una forma lo más coordinada posible la gestión del parque tecnológico con las empresas, como decía antes, estar muy involucrado en toda la problemática, ser flexibles. Creamos un fondo anticíclico ya previamente para tener dinero en los momentos en que recaudábamos bastante. El parque se autosustenta y es superavitario. Y con el excedente nosotros lo que hacemos es, junto con capital que pone el Estado, hacer infraestructura, generar infraestructura. Con ese fondo anticíclico hemos tratado de sostenernos, hemos tratado de activar la mayor cantidad de obras posibles con el dinero que nos iban dando, y una cosa que tratamos de hacer, y que esto tiene que ver con ese puerto de innovación que yo les mencionaba, es un puerto que se llama modular y flexible, porque justamente se puede ir creciendo de a poco, puede ir activando de a poco y puede ir empezando a recaudar dinero y fondos de a poco a la Argentina. O sea, uno no puede esperar a tener toda la obra para empezar a trabajar, se va trabajando desde el inicio, y eso es un poco la estrategia. Pero tuvimos mucha suerte, y creo que también las empresas de nuestro sector, si bien sufrieron, especialmente la pandemia, y después todos los avatares de la economía mundial, por su carácter de exportadores y por hacer las cosas bien, entiendo, no han sufrido lo que han sufrido otras. Pero bueno, en el fondo la macroeconomía nos golpeó también.
Bueno, una pequeña reflexión. En el caso de los sectores de servicio, a lo que hice mención en Córdoba, son sectores que por ahí su ecuación económica pueden resistir un poquito más algunos shocks macroeconómicos. Eso hablando de la macroeconomía. Como estábamos hablando de internacionalizar o inserción internacional, nosotros tenemos un problema con el tipo de cambio, con tipos de cambio múltiples. Eso obviamente a estas industrias les afecta y mucho. Pero bueno, también en Argentina las empresas han desarrollado cierto aprendizaje sobre cómo lidiar con estos aspectos. En nuestro caso nos enfocamos mucho en la micro y fue una gran oportunidad lo que mencionan aquí del talento. Bueno, para Córdoba es una gran oportunidad. Córdoba es una atracción de talento que viene por ahí de otras provincias, es un hub. Y en Córdoba, bueno, a través del potente sistema universitario, más de 12 universidades, tanto públicas como privadas. La primera universidad de Latinoamérica fue Córdoba. Sobre esas ventajas, queremos ventajas comparativas, queremos fortalecerlas y más. Y nos pusimos en una política agresiva de atraer mucho más talento. En ese sentido vimos como también una oportunidad de decir, hoy el mundo es competir por talento y lo que hay que desarrollar son capacidades para ser más competitivos. Les preguntamos a las empresas qué necesitan del sector público para que podamos hacer que eso sea de una manera más eficiente.
Bueno, excelente. Con esto vamos a dar por cerrado este panel. Súper interesante. Creo que se pudieron mostrar muy bien los casos. Y Dani, muchísimas gracias por los comentarios. Vamos a pasar ahora a la próxima etapa de este evento. Así que bueno, cerramos este panel.
La presente consta: Universidad de Buenos Aires, resolución número 936/2024, Ciudad de Buenos Aires, jueves 15 de agosto de 2024. Visto la resolución del Consejo Directivo número 2339/24 de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas, mediante la cual solicita se otorgue al doctor Dani Rodrik el título de doctor honoris causa de esta universidad, y considerando que el docente Rodrik ha obtenido los títulos de licenciado en Artes de la Universidad de Harvard, Estados Unidos de América, maestría en Asuntos Públicos y doctor en Filosofía en Economía de la Universidad de Princeton, también de Estados Unidos de América, que el doctor Rodrik se desempeña como profesor en la Universidad de Harvard, Estados Unidos de América, que ha dictado cursos y seminarios en el Instituto de Estudios Avanzados y de la Universidad de Columbia, ambos de Estados Unidos de América, que ha publicado varios libros, entre los cabe destacar ¿Ha ido demasiado lejos la globalización? Hablando claro sobre comercio, ideas para una economía mundial sana, o también la paradoja de la globalización, la democracia y el futuro de la economía mundial, y también su libro Las reglas de la economía, los aciertos y los errores de la ciencia lúgubre, que ha publicado numerosos artículos en revistas internacionales relacionadas al área de su especialidad, tales como Revista de Crecimiento Económico, Revisión Anual de Economía, la Revista Económica, entre otras, que ha sido editor asociado de numerosas revistas sobre temas de su especialidad, que actualmente se desempeña como miembro del Consejo Asesor de la revista Revisión de Economía y Estadística y del Consejo Editorial de la revista Estudios sobre Desarrollo Internacional Comparado, que es coeditor de Revistas de Globalización y Desarrollo, que ha obtenido varios premios, tales como el Premio de Princesa de Asturias de Ciencias Sociales, los 50 pensadores más importantes del mundo según la revista Prospect, Premio Albert Hirschman, entre otros tantos, que ha sido distinguido por numerosas universidades extranjeras, tales como Universidad Erasmus del Reino de los Países Bajos y Universidad de Lyon de la República de Francia, Universidad de York del Reino Unido, Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, de la República del Perú, entre otras, que es miembro de diversas asociaciones y sociedades científicas relacionadas al área de su especialidad, entre las que se destacan Asociación Económica Internacional, Academia Pontificia de Ciencias Sociales, Asociación Americana para el Avance de la Ciencia y Academia de Ciencias de Turquía, que según lo dispuesto por el artículo 98, inciso G, del Estatuto Universitario y por las normas reglamentarias encuadradas en el capítulo A, Código UBA-I 31, lo aconsejado por la Comisión de Enseñanza y lo dispuesto por este Consejo Superior en su sesión del día 14 de agosto de 2024, por ello, y en uso de sus atribuciones, el Consejo Superior de la Universidad de Buenos Aires resuelve, artículo primero, otorgar al doctor Dani Rodrik el título de doctor honoris causa de esta universidad. Artículo segundo, regístrese, comuníquese a la unidad académica interviniente y por su intermedio al interesado, a la Secretaría de Asuntos Académicos y a la Dirección General de Títulos y Planes. Cumplido, archívese. Firman la presente resolución el señor Secretario General Juan Alfonsín y el señor Vicerrector de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, profesor contador Emiliano Jacobiti. Seguidamente, el profesor Juan Carlos Hallak formulará el elogio académico al profesor Dani Rodrik.
Distinguidas autoridades, colegas, alumnas y alumnos, señoras y señores. Es un enorme placer y privilegio para mí tener oportunidad de pronunciar estas palabras en ocasión tan especial. La Universidad de Buenos Aires ha decidido distinguir al profesor Dani Rodrik con el título de doctor Honoris Causa. Reservamos esta distinción para pocos, en especial para aquellos que no solo han forjado una trayectoria académica al más alto nivel, sino también que han logrado moldear con su trabajo académico la forma en la cual pensamos los problemas más relevantes para nuestro país. Este es el caso de Dani Rodrik, quien ha contribuido a construir, a través de una gran cantidad de libros, artículos y notas de difusión, una mirada nueva sobre cómo abordar el desarrollo económico y productivo, el cual es todavía para nosotros un desafío central. Por eso queremos homenajearlo con esta distinción. En lo personal, agradezco profundamente el privilegio de poder repasar brevemente su trayectoria, así como la relevancia de su trabajo. Los países de América Latina han tenido en las últimas décadas desempeños económicos diversos. A algunos les ha ido mejor que a otros, siendo nuestro caso, no hace falta decirlo, de los más pobres. Sin embargo, ninguno ha logrado acceder a los estándares de vida de los países más avanzados, en gran parte porque no hemos logrado desarrollar suficientemente las capacidades productivas necesarias para darle sustento. Sin embargo, a pesar de la importancia de entender los determinantes del desarrollo productivo, su estudio en la disciplina económica, especialmente para el caso de los países como el nuestro, a menudo llamados semi-industrializados, ha sido mayormente relegado a un segundo plano. En ese marco de desentendimiento, el profesor Rodrik ha sido un faro de luz que ha guiado a académicos y hacedores de política a mantener el interés y la preocupación por estos temas, así como a replantear su abordaje desde la academia y el policy making, siempre mostrando una gran capacidad para influir en la conversación pública de manera pragmática y tendiendo puentes con audiencias más amplias. Desde esta casa valoramos enormemente este rol de liderazgo intelectual. Permítanme, en los pocos minutos que tengo, destacar algunos elementos centrales de su contribución. Durante los años 90, ante el desmoronamiento de la confianza en la capacidad del Estado para guiar el proceso de desarrollo económico, prevaleció como pensamiento dominante la idea de que el rol del Estado debía limitarse a proveer condiciones transversales fundamentales como la estabilidad macroeconómica y el respeto por la propiedad privada. En cuanto a la estructura productiva y el comercio internacional, las fuerzas del mercado inducirían la especialización en base al aprovechamiento de las ventajas comparativas. Con base en esta convicción, fue común en América Latina que los países desregularan sus economías, liberaran el comercio internacional y discontinuaran un amplio conjunto de políticas que había caracterizado la estrategia de sustitución de importaciones. Sin embargo, estos cambios no lograron los objetivos deseados, ni los esperados. A diferencia de algunos países exitosos de Asia, nuestros países no lograron converger a los estándares productivos del mundo desarrollado. Pero incluso ante estas expectativas frustradas, no se volvió a generar en la disciplina económica el interés y el foco en los determinantes del desarrollo productivo y en las políticas públicas para lograrlo, a diferencia del cuantioso volumen de energía intelectual que había sabido atraer este tema en tiempos de los viejos pensadores del desarrollo. Por consiguiente, existía un vacío en la disciplina que no ofrecía alternativas adecuadas para abordar la problemática del desarrollo para países como el nuestro. El profesor Rodrik llenó durante mucho tiempo ese vacío. Su contribución se materializó por distintas vías. En primer lugar, cuestionó la base de evidencia empírica, econométrica, sobre la que se predicaban los beneficios de una economía abierta. identificando serias deficiencias metodológicas en las investigaciones previas. En especial, su influyente trabajo con Francisco Rodríguez y Subramanian y Trevi fue central para levantar la vara empírica de la discusión y transmitir la idea de que la apertura comercial por sí sola no garantizaba mejores resultados económicos. Rodrik también aportó nueva evidencia y marcos conceptuales para argumentar en contra de una visión pasiva o estática sobre los beneficios de la especialización basados en la ventaja comparativa como estrategia óptima para el desarrollo. Asimismo, con Ricardo Hausmann señaló que los resultados de la inversión para explorar y eventualmente descubrir nuevas actividades en las que un país puede ser competitivo están sujetos a problemas de apropiabilidad que desincentivan dicha inversión, dificultando así la diversificación productiva y la modificación de los patrones de especialización. Pero Dani Rodrik no solo cuestionó en su momento un pensamiento económico dominante, sino que construyó y promovió una nueva mirada sobre cómo apoyar el desarrollo productivo de los países mediante la política pública. Dos críticas centrales a la forma de intervención estatal para promover el desarrollo productivo, típico del modelo de sustitución de importaciones, eran, por un lado, que los gobiernos no tenían la información necesaria para identificar las fallas de mercado que debían ser resueltas. Por el otro, que aún existiendo justificación para algún tipo de intervención estatal, dicha intervención terminaba siendo perpetuada por el lobby privado. Estas críticas siguen siendo convincentes cuando pensamos en la protección arancelaria o las exenciones impositivas, que han sido las herramientas típicas de intervención bajo dicho modelo. Sin ir más lejos, aún hoy se aplican a la política de promoción económica que absorbe la mayor cantidad de recursos públicos en nuestro país, el subrégimen industrial de Tierra del Fuego. Sin embargo, Rodrik, en su trabajo con Chuck Seibel y Ricardo Hausmann, planteó que la política de desarrollo productivo, también llamada política industrial, aunque su aplicación no esté limitada a la industria, no debe ni necesaria ni centralmente consistir en decisiones burocráticas que elijan sectores a ser beneficiados a través de exenciones tributarias, cuantiosos subsidios o protección comercial. Por el contrario, existe una enorme variedad de insumos públicos en áreas tan diversas como la capacitación laboral, la promoción comercial, la construcción de infraestructura o la investigación, que son necesarios para complementar la actividad de los sectores productivos, permitiendo que la misma se desempeñe en un ámbito competitivo. Y la buena noticia es que esta nueva forma de entender la intervención estatal en la promoción del desarrollo productivo está mayormente exenta de las críticas tradicionales. No se basa en una burocracia que deba definir beneficios tributarios o comerciales a sectores estratégicos, sino en una capaz de escuchar las necesidades del sector privado en ámbitos de interacción y coordinación adecuados. Los riesgos de captura son también mucho menores, ya que la ayuda estatal consiste en instancias de apoyo más específicas y no en un flujo continuo de beneficios impositivos que después cuesta remover. Esta es una visión muy distinta de lo que significa hacer política de desarrollo productivo. Una visión que tiene cada vez más asidero en la consideración académica y que ha sido progresivamente adoptada por organismos multilaterales como el BID, que en su momento hizo un monumental trabajo en darle mayor volumen a esta mirada, y muy recientemente incluso por la mismísima CEPAL. Con el mismo ímpetu, en años recientes, Dani Rodrik ha analizado nuevos problemas del desarrollo y de la economía mundial, enfocándose en estrategias para lograr una economía más inclusiva y sustentable. Por ejemplo, viene advirtiendo que la organización económica actual, especialmente por medio de la automatización y la hiperglobalización, no genera suficientes empleos de calidad. En este sentido, ha destacado los límites de una estrategia centrada exclusivamente en la industrialización para enfrentar el desafío crítico de crear empleos de alta calidad. Recomienda, en cambio, un enfoque integral de política económica que abarque la innovación, la capacitación laboral y la inversión en infraestructura clave, y que apunta especialmente a los servicios, debido a que la industria por sí sola difícilmente pueda generar la cantidad necesaria de dichos empleos. A la vez, también ha planteado que el objetivo de aumentar la producción no debería ser contrapuesto al de preservar el ecosistema. Junto con Tilman Altenburg, presentó el concepto de política industrial verde, un enfoque que combina el crecimiento económico con la sostenibilidad ambiental promoviendo sectores sostenibles como las energías renovables y transformando sectores contaminantes. En síntesis, la contribución de Dani Rodrik ha sido enorme. No solo ha aportado conceptos y evidencia que nos ayudan a moldear nuestro entendimiento del desarrollo productivo como fenómeno económico, sino también ha sido un protagonista central en la construcción de un abordaje nuevo y relevante a un tema central de política pública como es la política productiva. En ese camino nos recuerda que el desarrollo no es automático, sino que requiere de acciones claras, decididas y coordinadas de los gobiernos para crear condiciones adecuadas para el progreso. El legado de Dani Rodrik trasciende la academia. Sus ideas nos instan como sociedad a replantearnos el camino hacia un desarrollo inclusivo y sustentable. Por estas razones, la Universidad de Buenos Aires se enorgullece de otorgar el título de doctor Honoris Causa al profesor Dani Rodrik en reconocimiento a sus contribuciones académicas y su incansable trabajo por redefinir las estrategias de desarrollo del siglo XXI. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor Hallak. Invitamos al señor vicerrector de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, profesor contador Emiliano Jacobiti, a hacer entrega del diploma y medalla al doctor Dani Rodrik como honoris causa de la Universidad de Buenos Aires.
Again, my deepest thanks and gratitude to the University of Buenos Aires for this great honor, which I will cherish, and also my friend Juan Carlos for those really amazing words. I think these days giving an award or an honor to an economist takes a little bit of courage, honestly. Especially in a country like Argentina, where one can question the record of economists in so many different ways. And sort of that reminds me of a story that I sometimes like to tell about economists, and it's a little story about an economist, an architect, and a physician who are traveling in a long journey in a train, and they fall into this conversation about which one of their professions is more honorable. And the physician says, look, before there were people around the planet, God created Eve out of Adam's rib, and that was an act of surgery. So obviously, my profession, medicine, goes all the way back. And the architect says, well, hold on, before there was Adam and Eve, God had to create the universe out of chaos. That was an act of architecture. So my profession predates you. And the economist turns to his friends and says, well, where do you think chaos came from? And then this is a story that, of course, I heard from an economist. So economists are only too aware of the reputation that they have in the general public for not always being responsible for good things. And I think one of the respects in which economists and the economics profession has failed, and this is going to be a segue to my presentation, one of the respects in which economists have failed is in being unable to avoid fads and fashions, with the pendulum in economic thought moving back and forth between one extreme about the role of government in the economy and another one, with sort of this extremes, of course, is one that you're extremely familiar with in Argentina, sort of this movement from a role of the government, which is in some sense overly repressive of markets, and another one which thinks that all that needs to happen is that governments need to get out of the way of markets, and then all good things will follow. I want to begin my talk with one of the people who played a critical role in sort of in this transition in the advanced countries of the world, were sort of then mimicked and copied in the rest of the world. A transition that today we call the neoliberal transition, the transition from the social democratic welfare state consensus of the post-war decades to a kind of a much more market fundamentalist view of economic policy. And appropriately, it was in the year 1980 when Milton Friedman, one of the apostles of a market fundamentalist view of economic policy, was in the year 1980 that Milton Friedman had this extremely popular and influential TV series. This was before, looking at the audience, before most of you were born. But for people of my generation, this in many ways was, put an important stamp on our experience. And this series was called The Free to Choose. And it was really an argument for free markets. And in a particularly memorable point in this TV series, Milton Friedman held up this pencil, as you can see in the picture, and he says, look at this pencil. It took thousands of people to produce this pencil, to cut the wood, to mine the graphite, to design, to put it all together, and then to market and sell it all over the world. And these people, most of them had no idea of each other's existence. And how is this miracle of coordination made possible? It was made possible by markets. It's markets that coordinate and make this incredibly important, sort of difficult job a reality. It was a kind of a parable about the magic of markets, about how markets can achieve this incredible feat of coordination, something that humans couldn't do. Well, some decades later, there's an interesting coda to Milton Friedman's story about pencils, because we know that today, most of the world's pencils are made in China. And that's not because China has the best graphite in the world. It's not that it has the best forests, in fact, better forests elsewhere. It's not because China has the best technology. Germany and the US has much better technology. Maybe China at the time had a lot of low-wage, low-cost labor, but there are certainly countries like Ethiopia, Bangladesh, which have even cheaper labor. And there was actually no real reason why, in the end, the production of pencils, as in so many other manufactured products, got concentrated in China, except that, in fact, the Chinese government strategically intervened in markets to establish competence and in manufacturing activities, productively upgrade its economy and diversify into new areas. So magic of markets, yes, to some extent, because if there were no global markets, there would not have been the incentive to produce and sell in China. But it went far beyond markets, and it took a government that was intent on productive diversification through a variety of policies that range all the way from subsidies to exchange rate policy to government R&D to state-owned enterprises and so forth to make this a success for China. Well, you might say, well, China is a country, is a universe of its own, and what China does, other countries cannot do. An example closer to home is the experience of Chile. Of course, Chile, to many today, is a kind of a country that sort of is sometimes the Chilean growth story is told as a kind of a version of Milton Friedman's market miracle. But the fact is that you look at Chile's productive structure, and you look at basically not just its main exports, which is copper, which is mainly produced by a state-owned company, but you look at virtually every non-traditional export of the Chilean economy, and you can find the hand of the government in some significant stage of the evolution of that industry in providing the kind of support that was needed to have these non-traditional exports take off. One of the earliest examples, of course, is table grapes, and that industry, which is particularly important in Chile, was originally developed thanks to public R&D efforts of the Chilean government, which invests not just in R&D, but actually sent a lot of students abroad to UC Davis to essentially ensure that this technology would be appropriated and the technology transferred to Chile. In terms of the forestry sector, another important sector, this is a sector that has always received government support. In fact, it was the only, Pinochet is known as, of course, as the, as a kind of a market libertarian, but it was, a sector that he heavily subsidized despite his market leaning. And of course, in salmon is a well-known case of how a quasi-governmental organization, Fundación Chile, essentially operated like a public venture capital firm and invested in a lot of non-traditional technologies, non-traditional products, and one of the big hits was salmon, and Chile rose to be one of the most important producers of salmon. So again, the role of the state. Now, we can then go back to the examples we heard, very different types of examples that we heard from Argentina's own experience in the panel that precedes my presentation about how at the municipal level, in terms of developing capabilities in tech hubs, in biotech, in a variety of service industries and exports, local governments and state agencies are playing a significant role within Argentina. Now, the original conception of a market economy, a capitalist system, rightly stress that the importance of markets, source of and economic dynamism. And that was essentially the central insight of Smith. And this Adam Smith and other economists that followed him stressed the importance of market competition, the role of private incentives, the role of division of labor. And the textbook renditions, the way that this has sort of this conception, the Smithian conception of capitalism made its way into the textbooks, was that essentially the state you needed a very limited role for the state. And the role of the state was essentially restricted to providing for national defense, for some system that would protect the system of property rights, and some system to administer justice. Now, if you read, of course, Adam Smith had a much broader conception of the state, but the textbook rendition of this version, original version of market capitalism, as distinct from the system of thought that predated it, which was mercantilism, was that basically a limited role of the state, limited to these. Okay. And of course, that's a tradition of thinking in economics that has survived to our day in what in the 19th century was called the liberal view, but today is more appropriately called sort of the libertarian vision. And this is a vision of markets that both are and should be separate and disembedded from politics and the state. Now, the reason that sort of this has had such, has captivated our mind and our sort of generations of economic students' minds is that because it came along with a textbook depiction of markets that left a lot of the details aside. So the textbook depiction of markets is that, well, you have a supply curve and you have a demand curve. Okay, all the students here, you have seen this. And the supply side is, of course, the firms. They respond to price incentives, so they have this upward sloping supply curve. And then on the demand side, you have customers the consumers, and they have a kind of a downward sloping demand curve, okay? And that's all there is about markets, basically any introductory course in economics, and in fact, often even more so in a doctoral course in economics. That's essentially all that you need to know about markets, and the rest is really about sort of going into the details of how firms and consumers will react under different kinds of circumstances. But when you think a little bit deeper, you tend to understand that in order for this relationship to really result in productive dynamism, for economic dynamism, to result in innovation and investment, a growing economy that can provide for material benefits for a larger and a growing economy, that you need really a lot of things. In particular, firms need a lot of things to be prosperous. They need, of course, appropriately trained workers. They need a variety of intermediate inputs that are provided by their suppliers. They need access to cheap credit, access to capital markets. They need to operate in an environment where there is basically enough R&D and infrastructure so that they can access transportation networks. They have access to energy. And then they need to be protected from predators. And those could be bandits, gangs. And so you need to be protected against theft, violence, or expropriation. And of course, many of these public functions will need to be paid for by taxes, and therefore they need to also be in an environment where there is a reasonable tax administration. So when you think about all these requisite functions that need to be in place for what this sort of demand and supply diagram to really result in the kind of productive dynamism and innovation that you think they will, you need a whole range of other institutions, if you will, market supporting institutions to exist. And those market institutions have to provide all these range of services, from investing in education and training to providing the kind of labor legislation to enforcing contracts to undertaking the right kinds of investments in the public infrastructure and R&D to ensure that you have the right kinds of banking and securities and bankruptcy legislations and so forth. So I think, therefore, the image of capitalism that I call capitalism 2.0, or a version of markets that are really embedded in these institutions, is the one that sort of came to dominate in a more recent versions of how we think about what capitalism needs in order to function. And the critical insight here, to add on Adam Smith's insight that markets are this wonderful engine for growth, the critical insight in the second version was that, in fact, markets are not on their own self-creating. They're not on their own self-regulating. They're not on their own self-stabilizing. They're not on their own self-legitimizing. And therefore, they need to be embedded in a very wide range of institutions that actually provide those functions. So markets, anything other than just face-to-face, short-term market interactions, anything beyond that need extensive legislative institutions of property right provision and contract enforcement. In order to ensure that markets work well, you need regulatory institutions on antitrust, on prudential regulations, environmental and safety regulations, appropriate labor market institutions, and of course a wide range of institutions that also correct market and coordination failures, which productive development policies or industrial policies are really about. And of course, I don't need to tell this audience that markets actually need market stabilizing institutions that are institutions of macroeconomic management. And these necessarily go beyond simply, policies that are episodic. They need to be embedded in the practices of fiscal policy institutions in central banks that carry these stabilizing functions on an ongoing basis. And perhaps most important of all, perhaps, you need to have institutions that legitimize the outcomes, the distributive outcomes that markets produce. And ultimately, democracy and redistributive taxation and social welfare state arrangements have been the legitimizing institutions that developed over the course of the 20th century to make market outcomes compatible with sort of conceptions of distributive justice and broader social welfare. So the whole story really here is about a balance. Okay, you can get the balance wrong in one of two ways. You get the balance wrong in the sense of thinking that essentially the state has to control the economy, and that would be kind of a extreme left or a sort of Marxian view of the economy, where the economy would essentially be devoid of innovation incentives, would restrict consumer choice, and would restrict significant amount of freedom in the economic domain as well. But you can also go wrong in the other direction, which is in the direction of laissez-faire. That's Friedrich Hayek, by the way, and an economy that was run on the basis of laissez-faire would produce instability, inequality, and underinvestment in general. So the balance is provided by, you may want to call it any name that you want, but here I call it the mixed economy. These two people are Adam Smith and Keynes, and I combine them as exemplars of capitalism 1.0 and capitalism 2.0. But again, I think the challenges today are of a nature that's significantly different, that I think we even need to go beyond Smith and Keynes today. But that's really when you get the productive dynamism is a combination of market incentives with public institutions that regulate, legitimize, stabilize, and create markets. So this is a very ambitious title for essentially sort of my one slide summary of what in fact has produced rapid economic development in recent economic history. And that's how I'm going to summarize this. I'm going to summarize that by saying that the sine qua non clearly is in macro fundamentals. Sine qua non in the sense that without macro fundamentals, it's really very difficult to get sustained economic growth. That means reasonable, stable fiscal and monetary policies. Again, is Argentina's failure number one, and that's without question the reason why macroeconomic stabilization is such an urgent priority for Argentina today. It would also be sort of macro fundamentals would include sort of reasonably business-friendly or market-friendly policy regimes, and also steady investments in human capital and institutions such as governance and regulation. So those are, broadly speaking, what I would call sort of the macro fundamentals. I think the global context matters. A development-friendly global context would be one where catching up countries have access to markets, capital, and technologies of advanced countries, and that is broadly an environment of peace, security, and political stability. Right? So that global context matters. I would call these two items, the macro fundamentals and a development-friendly global context, as essentially the necessary components of rapid economic growth. But you can get these things, but not get rapid economic development. There are many countries in the world that have had low inflation for decades, have never really grown. Until recently, actually, India was one of those. India was a country that sort of for decades was a very low inflation country, but was never doing very well on the growth front. There are many countries in sub-Saharan Africa like that. So that's where the third item really becomes important, that when we look at countries that have done well, that have achieved rapid economic growth, they've built on these macro fundamentals and a conducive global economic context by implementing a series of what I would call pragmatic, orthodox, opportunistic, often unorthodox government policies to stimulate productive diversification, productive upgrading. Okay? In the past, that has typically been to promote manufacturing and industrialization, although I will caution you that just in a bit I'm going to say, and I think Juan Carlos highlighted this in his introductory remarks, that I think industrialization is no longer playing the role that it did in the past, so we need to pay much more attention to services today. Now, what's important to realize that while it's easy to sort of summarize at a broad level this third item as the series of policies targeting productive upgrading, it's much more difficult to say concretely what those policies have been, because from country to country, the nature of these policies have been different. Even if you look at just within East Asia, or even the East Asian tigers, the manner in which South Korea promoted export on the industrialization was different from the manner in which Taiwan promoted export-oriented industrialization, from which Singapore or Malaysia promoted export on the, they used different policy instruments. And of course, China used a whole variety of others as well. So while the objective of having a government that's actively nudging the private sector to move into different areas and productively upgrade has been common in virtually all rapidly growing countries, the specific policies have been different. That's where the hard work of figuring what works locally has to be done. I'm going to, I have a bunch of slides now on the specifics of industrial policy or productive development policy, but I'm going to run through these rather quickly because I don't want to keep you here for very long, and many of these are probably going into sort of more detail than is necessary. So the industrial policy or productive development policies are essentially these sort of these policies of the third category. There's been a lot of developments in how we think about these policies, and I sort of, by way of summary, I just want to use my last few minutes by summarizing both sort of the evidence on these policies as well as how our conception is changing. Okay? As you all know, the rest of the world is actually sort of moving towards policy, towards a much more benign view, in fact, sort of positive view towards industrial policy. So the United States has moved from essentially rejecting the use of industrial policies to essentially, shouting from the rooftops that they're explicitly engaged now in industrial policies. The change in rhetoric is much more dramatic than the change in actual policies, because in the United States, even during the 1980s or 1990s, there was always beneath the radar screen significant amount of industrial policy in the United States, but now it's sort of has been ratcheted up through the IRA, the CHIPS Act, and also sort of doing it much more self-consciously than before, and in pursuit of a very, very large number of objectives, from good jobs to supply chain resilience to the green transition. Now, what is industrial policy? Brief description of industrial policy was that it would be that government policies that explicitly target the transformation of the structure or the productivity of economic activity in pursuit of some public goal. And so in that sense, it's very broad, and you can see that many of the things that we were discussing in the panel just before my presentation now really would fit under that heading. What's important is that, and what makes in some sense these policies controversial, is because there's always an element of choice. So we're going to encourage a certain set of activities, but at the expense of not doing it for others, right? So we promote X, but implicitly not Y. So even if you're not actually, providing tax incentives or subsidies, but as government officials, you're spending bandwidth or time with particular producers, that means you have less time left to spend on more horizontal policies or with other producers. So this element of choice is critical. The economic rationale for these policies is actually very strong. Economic theory has a whole variety of arguments as to why industrial policies are desirable. They range from the presence of learning externalities to coordination failures, the need to bring suppliers and producers downstream, or complementary investors with scale economies together, to thirdly, the need to provide missing firm or sector-specific public inputs, which could be specialized workforce training, particular kinds of infrastructure, or particular legal administrative arrangements. So the reason among economists productive development policies or industrial policies have a negative reputation is not because they don't have a good rationale, economic rationale. It always has been about practical arguments. Two practical arguments in particular: that governments can never have adequate information to know where they should intervene. That's the inadequate information argument. And then second argument about bad politics, that governments are prone to political capture by powerful insiders. Now, both of those are relevant, but when you think about them for a second, you realize that actually these counter-arguments to the use of industrial policy are not specific to industrial policy. Anytime a government is doing something, whether it's in education policies, or whether it's in banking regulation, or whether it's regulating energy markets, it's always potentially prone to these problems, that it might not have adequate information, or that in its attempt to make things better, it might make them worse because the policies are going to be captured. So therefore, as in all these other areas of policy, the right conclusion to draw from these practical worries is not that we should not be doing productive development policy. After all, when people talk about, oh, you should not regulate energy markets, or you should not have education policy because they could be captured. Well, that seems like a silly argument. The real argument is, well, we need to make sure that our education policy is not going to be captured, let's say, by powerful insiders. So it's really about how we do education policy, and not whether we should do education policy or not. So I think we should think about industrial policy or productive development policies in exactly the same way. So the real question is not whether, but how. I think in the advanced countries today, interestingly, both in Europe and in the United States, we are at that stage that the question is no longer whether, but it's really how. So let me just say a few things about sort of what the bit about the how, about what recent evidence tells us. One is the significant importance of industrial policies in the green transition. There have not been very many bright spots in the global fight against climate change, but one area where there has been significant advance is actually in the very sharp decline in the price of renewables. It's been mainly due to the industrial policies of China in promoting solar and wind power, and then lately electric vehicles and batteries. That's among the most important advances that we've had. So China has managed through these industrial policies not only to gain significant global competitive advantage in these industries, but China has actually done the rest of the world a huge favor by bringing down the cost of non-fossil fuel sources of energy. And Chinese policies have been much more than subsidies. That's really, again, a point that we keep coming back to, that industrial policies that work is not simply about subsidies. There's been a lot of subsidies, including sort of at the local municipal level. But Chinese government has used a variety of instruments, from credit instruments to public investment in R&D infrastructure, to policies on government procurement, to demonstration programs, to regulatory changes, to industry consolidation. It has used all levels of government in pursuit of this, national, provincial, city, with a lot of competition among municipal governments in providing in doing these kinds of policies. An explicitly collaborative approach where the national government helps local governments with demonstration programs and experimentation, and then the learning percolates up. An explicit recognition that programs have to be revised and they have to be flexible. Therefore that sort of iteration that's being built into the program. And there's been some recent evidence that actually shows that the system has provided what it was intended to do. Now, it's easy to just focus on the successful cases, but there have also been failures. Even in green industrial policy, a very well-known case was Solyndra in the United States, where the US actually gave $500 million loan to this solar firm, Solyndra, and then the firm went bankrupt. It was a big political scandal in the United States. Everybody sort of said, look, industrial policy doesn't work. But in fact, you have to look at policies of this kind as a basket, as a kind of investing simultaneously in a number of different enterprises. Some will work, others will not work. You cannot pick on only the failures. And in fact, Tesla, the hugely successful company, nearly around the same time benefited from a nearly similar sized loan from also the Department of Energy. And that was crucial for Tesla's survival. So if you add all the winners, all the successes, including probably Tesla alone, it more than pays for some of the failures. So the lesson here is to think about industrial policy as a portfolio, not to stick with losers, know how to get out of losers, but not that the right lesson isn't that you shouldn't be doing this at all. There's been a lot of work recently on place-based policies. This is on promoting investment and job creation in places that are left behind, regional policies. Again, our priors as to whether these policies work have been significantly revised by this new generation of policies, that new generation of evidence, that we find that in fact these kinds of policies do work. Now, most of these new papers of empirical evidence focus on subsidy policies. But what we've also learning is that, again, subsidies are not necessarily the best way of generating more job growth, more investment in left behind places, that often customized public inputs, whether it's particular infrastructure or customized training or extension services, are much more effective in terms of creating jobs than subsidies. So that's another important redirection of our industrial policies. Third, importance of, again, coming back, that it's not going to be manufacturing in the future. It's going to be much more services. Let me just put it this way, that in China has lost in the last 2 decades as many manufacturing workers as the total number of manufacturing workers that exist in the United States and Germany, right? The delta, the change, the reduction in employment in China is the same as the total employment in manufacturing in the United States and in Germany. So what is this saying? That manufacturing is now no longer a labor-absorbing sector. So if you're concerned about inclusive growth, about increasing productive opportunity, it'll have to be in services, and in particular in labor-absorbing services. So IT and so forth, biotech is great, but those will not be necessarily the ones that are going to be generating the services and will create the middle class that you're looking for. So I think we will need to look for a whole variety of productive development policies that actually engage with labor-absorbing services. That could be anything from community services to ride-sharing services to helping small retailers become more productive. And there's a variety of pilot programs and empirically evaluated programs around the world that have looked at how you can incentivize entrepreneurship, productivity, upgrade the use of IT and others in a way that actually increase employment. And I just summarized a few of these in this slide. So I do think, therefore, that there is now a conception of productive development policies and industrial policies that is becoming much more widely shared and appreciated as a critical element of economic development policies, a critical underpinning of economic growth, as a component of a strategy that obviously focuses on price stability and macroeconomic stability first and foremost. But without those policies, you're not necessarily going to get high growth. But as I've stressed here, and I also summarize in this figure here, that the nature of industrial policies or productive development policies are really changing significantly. You can't go back to the 1960s or 1970s and resuscitate the productive development policies or industrial policies of that period. We'll have to innovate, and they'll have to take different character in the ways that I've emphasized here. Thank you very much for listening. So let me just end my presentation. I again thank from the bottom of my heart UBA for the honor. Really tremendous pleasure for me to, and thanks for joining us.
Bueno, ¿se escucha? Como estamos recogiendo las preguntas del público, luego se las vamos a hacer al profesor Rodrik. Alguien dijo que estamos camino de ser Alemania. Si es por el timing de esta conferencia, estamos en el buen camino porque no recuerdo ningún otro evento en esta universidad tan puntual. Yo voy a hacer uso del privilegio del moderador para hacerle un par de preguntas al doctor Rodrik mientras recogemos las preguntas de la audiencia. Se las voy a hacer en inglés simplemente para que la conversación sea más fluida. Well, thank you for your excellent presentation. You address a number of very relevant issues. I want you to further elaborate on two of them, which are, I think, particularly relevant for us. One of them is the concept of green industrial policy, which, as Juan Carlos said, you have developed with other colleagues. And as you are aware, a number of people deny that climate change exists. Let's them aside. But other people say, well, we are a developing country. I understand that climate change is a problem, but it's not our problem. We have our priority is development and job creation. So sustainability is a problem, is a concern of Europe, the United States, etc. So you talk about renewable energy, which is obviously part of green industrial policy, but how does the concept of green industrial policy apply to emerging countries like Argentina or other Latin American countries?
Thank you, Andrés. I think that's a great question. I mean, first, let me be clear that I do think that advanced countries owe a huge moral debt to ensure that through financial and technology transfers that developing countries have the incentive to engage in this transition, that it is not morally acceptable from any standpoint that developing countries or middle-income countries are essentially left their own and say, you have to do this when, you know, the carbon budget of the world has been largely extinguished by other countries that have already gotten rich. Now, having said that, it's also quite clear that without developing countries engaging in significant decarbonization efforts on their own, that there's no way in the world that simply by the advanced countries doing what they're already doing, which, and also China, that we will get anywhere near that, even if you want the 2 degrees maximum, warming up and so forth, that even without China, even with China excluded, developing countries very soon will be emitting more than half of the world's carbon. And so if there is a future of the world in which we have managed, climate change, it will be one where we have gone on this path. And then the question then becomes for developing countries, do I take on board in my development strategy that this is an inevitable future. That's essentially what China and some of the other East Asian countries have done, because you might have said that when China invested heavily in renewables and undertook the kind of industrial policies I was talking about that brought the cost of renewables down, you might have said exactly the same thing for China, that it wasn't a large part of the economy. Why, basically spend their own taxpayers' money on this? But the way they did it was to say, well, we need to do it for two reasons. One is that we will move in a world where it'll be difficult to develop through our usual strategies of carbon-intensive growth. And second, conditional on that, we better, sort of try to get, develop some commercial capabilities, competitiveness capabilities in the future of the world economies where sort of carbon-intensive exports will be penalized and won't be. So it's both, without diminishing the role of the advanced countries in ensuring that the financial and technological resources are available for developing countries. It is ultimately in the interest of developing countries to engage in the kind of, green industrial transitions to ensure that they have the requisite capabilities. And so a country like Argentina that's very rich on lithium, right? It's an obvious one to develop that because it's a critical input to many green industries. So that's, I think, the commercial case for it.
Thank you. Thank you for it. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Professor Rodrik. The other thing is of your presentation that I think is very disruptive and even provocative is the role you assign to services. Not, as you said, the services that are well known, such as software, etc., but you have written recently with your colleague, which has also visited us, Joseph Stiglitz, about the role of traditional services, which are mostly neglected in productive development discussions. And you have mentioned something about that in your presentation, but I would like you to further elaborate on that, because it is, at least for me, it's not easy to imagine how you can create the conditions for sectors such as retail, transportation, healthcare to become hubs of growth, absorbing employment, which has been the traditional role, but you also think that they can be made more productive and innovating. So if you can, I think this is very relevant and disruptive view in these discussions.
I think, Andrés, you're right to be puzzled by this, and I'm puzzled by it every day. And it's a conclusion that I reach by way of necessity rather than because it's a conclusion I want to reach. What I mean by this is that when I look at what is happening at manufacturing and how sort of manufacturing nowhere in the world, and certainly not in Argentina, a middle-income country, will be a labor-absorbing country. So no matter, with the best macroeconomic management industrial policy, you're not going to grow your employment share in manufacturing. I can guarantee you that. I'm willing to take a bet on this. Agriculture will continue to release labor to the rest of the economy. So it's hard to believe that people will be going back to the countryside. So what does that leave you? It just leaves you with services. Then services loosely come in two kinds of categories. One, you have these productively dynamic, tradable, but very important caveat, high-skill services, which are software, IT services, BPO, and so forth, which I think are as important as sort of productive manufacturing might be for the purposes of R&D, innovation, and driving economic growth. But that's, again, it's not where the jobs are going to be. The bulk of the jobs are going to go into the care sector, into health, into retail, in a lot of sectors where informal. So if you want, so you have two visions of the economy. One where you basically just focus only on these sort of parts of the economy which are the most productive and the most likely to engage in the world economy and be sources of competitive advantage. But that's sort of like engaging in the world economy being kind of a resource-rich country, which is, very capital-intensive, exports of copper or some other minerals, when you essentially have enclave sectors and the rest of the economy is not experiencing genuine development. And if you want to avoid that model, you have no other option but to say, okay, how can I increase productivity where the people will be? And that will be, so that's what I mean by I reached that conclusion by necessity. There's no other, I don't see any other option. So then the question arises, is it even realistic to increase productivity in those service sectors? And I'm encouraged by the variety, and that's the evidence I was summarizing, I think, on my penultimate slide, which is there's been a range of experiments and interventions where it is, you can see that by, for example, by providing community service workers some IT tools, where they can, do much better job of providing assistance to, let's say, pregnant women in the countryside, or by organizing and centralizing the purchases of, sort of informal retail sector workers and providing them with supplies in a centralized way, again, using some IT tools and digital apps, you can significantly reduce the amount of time they spend on obtaining their supplies and therefore make them more productive that way. Or again, by giving care workers some technological tools that enable them to do the jobs of people or nurses or physicians that are much more skilled than they are, enabling them to do those things through technological tools. There are a variety of experiments that show that it's in fact possible through a combination of organizational changes and the provision of new technologies that are specifically targeted at upgrading or increasing the range of things that very low-skilled people can do. It is possible to increase labor productivity in those labor-absorbing sectors. Now, you're never going to get the kind of productivity growth that you did with autos or steel or biotech. But the advantage is that if you're able to make progress with increasing productivity in these labor-absorbing service sectors like retail or care, you get much more inclusive development. You get directly build a middle-class society rather than having a trickle-down model of development, which would be the alternative when you focus only on the most productive sectors that are not labor-absorbing.
Okay, thank you. Hope you are right, because I hope you are right, because I agree that in manufacturing sector won't be a sector that can absorb many jobs in the near future, or in the distant future. I have a number of questions from the audience. Fortunately, none of them is about Argentina. And what's in your opinion, how can our countries benefit from the industrial policies adopted in developed countries? Or can we benefit from them, or perhaps they will be something that put obstacles to growth in our countries?
I know there are a lot of concerns about, the use of industrial policy in the United States and prospectively in Europe as well. But my take on this is very different. That is that if industrial policies are successful in the US in their avowed objectives of increasing innovation, rebuilding the middle class, and fastening the pace of the green transition, ultimately they provide benefits to the rest of the world too. Because I think kind of the best gift that a country like the United States can provide to the world economy and to other countries like Argentina is to actually, be a thriving, innovative economy that is not going to be further closing in on itself. So I think it's important to appreciate that just like as in the case of China, which engaged in all these industrial policies for decades, and all countries complained about closing of markets and discriminatory policies in China, ultimately, because these policies helped China grow much more rapidly, by the end, China became a much bigger market for everybody, and much bigger, market for investment for everybody. So it benefited the rest of the world. It didn't harm them. So I think we need to look beyond each one of the very sort of the small details in some of these policies that might be discriminatory, occasionally might raise trade restrictions and so forth. So if we keep our eye on the big picture, I think that the consequences might be good for developing countries as well.
You have written with your colleague Ricardo Hausmann. Sorry. You have said with your colleague Ricardo Hausmann that we are doomed to choose in terms of industrial policy. So a member of the audience asks, how can we, which are the mechanisms for choosing the right sectors, or at least avoiding the wrong sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of, productive development policy has to proceed on two tracks always. One is you work with your existing sector, existing producers, existing areas, and how can I improve them? And then you also try to move into different areas. So I think the question about sort of how do you move into different areas is the question. I think, there are different ways that you can go about it. You can use the kind of, product, maps that of the type that Ricardo has developed, looking at sort of, what other countries with similar what's close to your existing production structure. You can look at the experience of other countries that look like you but are somewhat a little bit richer and see what is it that they're producing that we're not. And so ultimately, it has to be kind of a venture capital mindset with the realization that you will inevitably make mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, you're not being sufficiently aggressive, but that if you make mistakes, you have to have mechanisms where you don't keep throwing good money after bad. So the problem with Solyndra wasn't that this firm got the loan. The problem was that the government persisted with supporting this firm long after it became clear that it wasn't going to be commercially viable. So it's about letting the losers go rather than sort of picking the winners. That's the critical capacity that you need.
Okay, so I have a number of questions. One of them is, I said, sorry, I keep making the same mistake. There is a question that you addressed in your presentation, the relation between macro stability and industrial policy. So, which is the sequence? Most economists think first macroeconomic stabilization, later on, perhaps we will discuss about industrial policy. What's your view?
I mean, in some sense, if you don't have, in an economy with inflation is at 3 digits or worse, nothing is going to happen. So if you don't solve that problem, you can't do anything. So there's a sense in which macroeconomic stability is the sine qua non of economic performance. But the issue here is, you don't have to completely undermine the capacity of the state to engage in productively transformative activities in the act of engaging in macroeconomic stabilization. So you want to do productive macroeconomic stabilization that's not going to undermine the capacity of the state to be a productive force for change in the future. Let me make another point here, another footnote here. I mean, there's one trade-off that often comes, which is that, well, in the context of macroeconomic stabilization, you need to cut down fiscal expenditures and industrial policies about subsidies, and therefore there might be a trade-off. But I hope it was clear from my presentation, also in a lot of our discussion in the earlier panel, that a lot of proper industrial policy or productive development policy is not about subsidies. It's about organizing yourself so you can solve problems collectively with the private sector. So doesn't necessarily create the kind of immediate fiscal burden that we normally think of when we think about subsidies.
Okay, thank you. And we have in development discussions, you mentioned this in your presentation, often the poster child are East Asian countries. Our countries are very different from East Asian countries, especially South American countries, which are rich in natural resources. So, which could be our models for development as developing nations which are rich in natural resources? Perhaps some of us think of Canada, Australia. Have we something to learn from those models?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. Because, I mean, if you asked me this question 15 years ago, I would have said, well, you know, there's no reason why other countries cannot emulate the kind of East Asian model of development. Take a country like Malaysia, for example. Malaysia is, you know, sort of rich in natural resources, and it was very successful at diversifying its productive structure and in industrialization. So, but today, you know, I don't see that path, that even the East Asian tigers would not be able to replicate their previous experience today. So the reality is that I don't think there are really models that for countries in the future. There aren't models because the global environment and the technological environment is critically different today in two respects, which we've already talked about. One is the climate change, right? That there's no way that your countries can engage in the kind of, you know, carbon-intensive industrialization patterns they did that was, you know, very important in the past. The second is the technology of manufacturing, which is it's no longer labor absorbing, it's labor shedding. And therefore, you cannot use manufacturing, you know, whether it's green or not, to generate a kind of a labor-absorbing productive transformation pattern. So those going forward, the facts of technological change in manufacturing and of the climate change challenge means that we're really moving into a world where, you know, there aren't existing models that countries can take on. So I know this is not a very encouraging conclusion, but I really don't have a model to offer.
There's another question which relates, I think, with the issue of this traditional services sector, which we have talked before, because it's about informality. Our labor markets have a huge share of the labor force is employed in informal activities, or they have a small business which have very low productivity. How can productive development policies help to reduce informality in our labor markets in Latin America?
I think the question the answer has a lot to do with what you think is the cause of informality. I mean, informality can be caused by regulations that make it costly for firms to formalize. Or it could be the result of low productivity that doesn't actually pay for firms to want to formalize. I think in most cases, I don't want to make a general statement, but I think in most cases it's the latter rather than the former. So I think the way to address informality is not to sort of overly fetishize formalization, but to say that, look, if we're successful at increasing productivity in our micro and small enterprise sector, by increasing productivity will also create as a byproduct increasing rates of formalization. Let me be clear that there's no way that any productive development policy in the world can increase across the board productivity in all these micro enterprises. So these policies necessarily have to be selective in the sense that you want to engage in policies where the more dynamic of micro enterprises will select into these programs. And therefore, ultimately, what you're looking for are those, sort of the more successful, the more dynamic, the more entrepreneurial of these micro enterprises to take advantage of these public inputs and be able to grow and absorb employment, while most of the rest will never grow. But I think, again, the main avenue to achieving this is through strategies that increase productivity.
There's another question about green industrial policy. Is green industrial policy the same that, or is reduced to foster the transition to renewable energies, or is larger than?
So, yeah, I mean, I think I see green industrial policies as a very important complement to carbon pricing. So you can think about the green transition by saying, look, what is the problem? The problem is that there's this huge global externality. And that, one way to solve this is by essentially having producers internalize the true social price of carbon. So that would be through some carbon pricing or carbon, emission taxation scheme. That on its own wouldn't solve the problem, because the green transition, that sort of, developing new technologies that are carbon free, that are not emitting carbon, necessarily is a process of innovation with lots of learning spillovers and externalities. And that's why you also need, green industrial policies to encourage the innovation for green industries as well. I think so in an ideal world, we would be using carbon pricing and green industrial policies to complement each other. What is now happening in the United States is that green industrial policies are essentially being used to pave the path towards policies that are directly going to focus on decarbonization. Carbon pricing is still not, except in regional and state level, not on the horizon at the federal level, but the idea is that if you create winners through green industrial policies, these renewable companies will act as a counterweight politically to fossil fuel companies, and will make over time a policy that directly confronts fossil fuels and decarbonization. So there's also a political complementarity between green industrial policy and carbon taxation.
Thank you. And there's a very difficult question.
You mean the earlier ones were easy?
No, this is more difficult. Well, at least for economists, or at least for economists like me, which are, because it's about how can we strengthen or improve our institutional capabilities. As you said, this is a problem that is not only about industrial policy, because if we don't have state capacities, we can't even manage the education system. But is there something to learn about other countries that have, as you said, capabilities are built?
Yeah, I think the first thing is yes, capabilities are built. So you don't let weakness of our institutions or to stop you from doing something that is socially useful, developmentally useful. Because let me put it this way. I don't know, not many of you, again, this is a more young audience, but some of you who are older here might maybe remember the time when, and this will not apply to Argentina because Argentina is a high inflation country, but the rest of Latin America was as inflation prone as Argentina. And the idea that you could have independent central banks that could really bring inflation down was seen like politically completely impossible. Yet, in a relatively short period of time, central bank independence, inflation targeting really became the norm. And so there was institutional development that once the objective and priority of targeting inflation and disinflation became very significant, you had corresponding institution building that produced that outcome. I would love to know why Argentina has bucked that trend, but I think Argentina is clearly an outlier. But the lesson there is that if you have clear priorities, if you have clear objectives, that you can develop the institutional capacity. But it requires sort of being, I think it requires thinking in a kind of experimental kind of a way. You cannot simply borrow what has worked in other countries. You have to think about what are the strategic opportunities. And no country is really a complete, web of weak institutions. Every country has some strong institutions. So some of the ways in which you can be successful is by being strategic about what you ask institutions to do, that putting competencies in the hands of institutions that tend to be stronger, and therefore sort of hoping that you can make progress that way. So there's a variety of strategies you can use. But again, as you said, we're economists, and we're really sort of way beyond our areas of domains of expertise when we're talking about building institutions.
There's another question that is also related with institutions to some extent, because it's about the reversal of industrial policy. So a lot of experiences of industrial policy in many countries like ours have been undermined by instability associated with the political cycles and other processes. So how can we build resilience because we know that industrial policies are effective in the long term, so instability is harmful for them.
Yeah, I think if you do things that work, and I do think that actually that industrial policy is something you can demonstrate quick successes in, then I think when the government changes, because that's the nature of democracies, I think that the new government coming in may change the name of the program, what will end up doing something similar because it's been successful. So we've seen examples of this throughout. So I think I'm less concerned about the weakness of democracies in terms of being able to sustain, because I don't think that good policy necessarily, has only short-term costs and long-term benefits. I think good policy has short-term benefits. And I think if it has short-term benefits, then there's an incentives for future governments to want to maintain it, because, why, you may want to change the name or do something that will, allow you to take ownership of these, but you will still want to continue doing something similar.
I have a couple of questions, and so are there any more questions? So it's okay. So one of them is about the differences between industrial policies in developing and developed countries. This relates to an issue I wanted to talk about with you, is the danger that the CHIPS Act, for instance, may induce other countries to think that industrial policy is the same that giving large amount of subsidies in countries which have no resources to do that. So how can we differentiate the priorities and the mechanisms of industrial policy in countries like the United States and countries like Latin American ones?
I think that's a great question. I think I'm on the whole, an advocate of the industrial policies in the US, but I do think that even for the US, they're excessively focused on subsidies, especially the IRA, the tax incentives there are really into, many, many hundreds of billions of dollars. So I think it's not just, with developing countries. I think even for the advanced countries, I think there's, excessive focus on tax incentives and subsidies. So how do we overcome that? I do think that, economists and researchers have an important role to play. And I think, a lot of the work that I and my colleagues are doing is precisely to emphasize that, look, what really works, even when you're talking about the green transition or, siting of advanced semiconductor plants, really what's really going to work is not simply showering these firms with, incredibly generous incentives, but talking to them, understanding what specific needs they need, whether it's just, sort of green fields or whether it's worker training or it's providing particular infrastructure. And that's going to be much more effective per number of jobs created, per dollars of investment than these tax incentives. So I think that's a general problem, not just for developing countries, but also for the advanced countries. And I think we need to do a lot more research to also, I think, demonstrate and change the conversation around industrial policy a little bit away from subsidies.
This relates to another concern, because you have written about randomized control trials, which have been very popular, as most of the audience know, as a tool for evaluating policies. But industrial policies are often hard to evaluate with randomized, because they are not implemented through randomized control trials, and it is often the case that we don't have very reliable instruments for identifying the causal effects of industrial policies. So how can we devise alternative methods of evaluating industrial policies when we don't, in cases in which we don't have these reliable econometric techniques?
Yeah. So I think you're right that sort of, RCTs are not very useful for evaluating industrial policies, except, sort of when, historically we can identify historical, accidents and sort of like, quasi-random experiments. But if you want to use evaluation for your current industrial policies, probably the most relevant technique is often there are programs where, for example, firms sign up for some benefit. It could be a subsidy or it could be some other public input. And then the government agency uses some kind of formula for deciding whether you get the benefit or not. And that then there's usually a cutoff. If you score above 10 on a scale of 15, let's say, you get the benefit. Not that creates a kind of discontinuity on who's getting the benefit and who's not. So there have been a number of evaluations of programs based on that kind of regression discontinuity approach, looking at firms just above the margin and below. So some programs can be evaluated that way. There have been evaluations also, many other programs are, for example, DARPA or ARPA-like programs, or the Department of Energy loan guarantee kinds of programs like the Solyndra or the Tesla loans that I've talked about. They're often, you can evaluate them as a kind of a portfolio, look at sort of how has the portfolio as a whole done. And so with those kinds of problems, you can do a portfolio evaluation and see what the overall benefits have been. But I would say one thing, which is that I don't think, as important as it is to researchers and economists to be able to causally pin down whether something worked and by how much, let's remember that the country that has been, without question, the most successful in the conduct of industrial policy is China. And as far as I know, the Chinese government has never done, ever, a formal, rigorous evaluation of any of its programs. It doesn't mean that it hasn't learned. It just doesn't do formal evaluation. There are other ways you can learn. And the way that the Chinese learning takes place is a kind of very informal process of setting up experiments or demonstration projects, looking at how different regions or provinces or municipalities are running it, sort of collecting information, informally sort of revising things, and then, stopping doing some things and doing more of the others, has worked very well without any kind of a rigorous program evaluation at all. So I think it's a mistake if you're thinking in policy terms to think that the only way you can learn from your experiments, policy changes, is by doing rigorous evaluations.
So, well, thank you. The last question, I think that the person who asked this question is doesn't believe is skeptical about renewable energies. The question is how can we grow based on renewable energies when the currently developed countries have grown based on fossil energies? So what is your answer to this skeptical view about
Well, again, I think we have actually a lot of reason to be optimistic on this score. The decline today is cheaper to sort of generate energy on the basis of renewables than it is using fossil fuels. We've actually crossed that point where it's cheaper to use solar and wind than it is, not for everything in the economy. It's still, harder to, produce steel with renewable energy, but, it is for, sort of a whole variety of consumer and industrial uses actually is cheaper to use. And that's something that nobody thought was going to be, feasible on the path that we're on, some 10 years ago. So it is, the price has come down. This is something that's technologically feasible. And so I think there are reasons to be much more. And by the way, developing countries in many ways are very well positioned. If you think about solar and wind, what are the inputs? Sun and wind. So that's much more widely distributed than fossil fuel deposits. For many low-income countries, actually, they're much better situated for using renewables energy sources.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your excellent presentation and for your answers, and thank you for visiting us. And we are very glad and honored for your visit. And thank you. Thanks to the audience for the interest and the questions.
Thank you. Thank you.